Sadly, messaging used by both sides in the campaign, and explain why I think Fidesz's message was
more powerful and persuasive than the United Opposition's message. Before I get into that, I want to stress that, of course, it's not all about messaging. So we've already heard that there are several things that tip the elections in Fidesz's favor. One of those is the ability to get your messages out there to voters again and again and again. Even if you've got good messages, they're not going to have an impact if they don't spread. And Fidesz's control of the media has allowed it to spread and repeat its messages in a way that wasn't available to the United Opposition. So apart from getting their messaging right, the United Opposition would also have needed to find ways of increasing their reach to voters. And I don't have a well-developed answer to that. We might take some inspiration from activism in the US, where we've seen Democrat activists beat much better funded Republican candidates in Senate races. And they've relied on techniques like community organizing and something called deep canvassing, which is different from traditional canvassing. And they may be things to look into a bit further. But for now, I'm just going to look at the messaging in the two campaigns. And I think that, apart from everything else, it's safe to say that Fidesz's messaging was more powerful. Their messaging, it appeals to voters' values, and they're good at eliciting an emotional response. And we know from research that the way that people vote isn't usually based on rational, logical thinking. People tend to vote for candidates who align with their values. And when I use the term values, I'm using it more in a scientific sense. It's something that social psychologists and cognitive linguists have been studying for decades. I won't go into detail. I'll just say that when you appeal to certain values in your communications, you can stimulate support for certain political attitudes, be they more authoritarian or more progressive. Fidesz tends to appeal to values like tradition, religion, security, its idea of the natural social and economic hierarchies, and they use fear-based messaging that manufactures an enemy or a crisis which they portray as threatening these values, and then they offer themselves as a cure to that threat. And as you mentioned, this is something that's been ongoing. So we've seen Fidesz do this on immigration, where it's painted people who migrate as a threat to security, tradition, religion, society's resources. And it's also painted the EU, NGOs, philanthropists as threats for trying to facilitate migration. We've seen smear campaigns against NGOs portrayed as threatening the stability of the country and working as agents who promote a foreign political agenda. More recently, we've seen it with Fidesz's attacks on LGBTIQ persons, whom they portrayed as a threat to children and their version of the family. And during the election campaign, Fidesz used the war in the Ukraine in a similar way by portraying the opposition as wanting to take Hungary to war by sending troops and weapons. So Fidesz manufactured this imminent threat of war, tied it to the opposition, and then portrayed themselves as the party that would maintain peace and stability. It wasn't the only issue in Fidesz's messaging, so they also portrayed the opposition as a threat to economic stability and voters' economic position by saying the opposition wanted to introduce austerity, cut back on pensions, and raise taxes. Now, we know from research that when politicians use messaging that makes people feel like things like tradition, sovereignty, religion, security, social and economic positions are under threat, it tends to make people favor parties with more authoritarian agenda. So basically, it pushes persuadable audiences to the right in their political preferences. When voters are scared, we know that they're more inclined to vote for candidates that offer strongman leadership, preservation of traditions, clampdowns on any groups or organizations that are seen to pose a danger to those values. So Fidesz has continuously used the same messaging approach over the years, just with different manufactured threats. And it's also a formula that's been used by the far right everywhere. And although it's very powerful, we do know that we can beat it. So there are a lot of case studies of successful campaigns in elections, also civil society campaigns, where progressives have won against opponents who are using this style of messaging. Like authoritarian messaging, persuasive, progressive messaging also appeals to values and emotions, but different ones. So broadly speaking, instead of using fear, they use hope and vision of a better future. I'm going to elaborate on two principles of persuasive, progressive messaging, and as I go, I will point out how the United Opposition tended not to get it right. So the first principle I'd highlight is that you have to say what you stand for rather than what you stand against. So you need to dedicate the bulk of your communications to reminding voters of what they would like their world to look like. So what are the things they want for themselves and the people that they care about? And when you do this, you paint a positive, hopeful vision instead of a fearful one. So you need to give your voters something to vote for and not just something to vote against. And when you're doing that, you also need to appeal to different values from the ones that Fidesz uses. So you don't make people afraid for their security, religion, tradition, socioeconomic status. Rather, you make people hopeful that they can come together across their differences to create greater freedom, to get the care that they need, to show their compassion to people around them, to build opportunities for and with each other. I'm going to illustrate this with a couple of examples. So imagine that one of your election pledges is to raise wages. A good way of framing that would be to say something like, most of us agree that people who work deserve enough to support their families. Or if your messaging is about raising the pension, you might say, all of us want to know that our older family members will never have to choose between putting food on the table and turning on the heating. Instead, the bulk of messaging from the United Opposition tended to be about problems. They tended to talk mostly about what they were fighting against rather than what they were fighting for. So on economic issues, the United Opposition's messages were about how Fidesz had caused an economic crisis, poverty, inflation, a collapse in the currency, austerity, and how everything was going to get worse if you elected them again. When the United Opposition did offer a vision of a better future, their solutions tended to always be in policy language. So they used phrases like index linking the pension, doubling family allowance, higher wages, eliminating petrol shortages, or creating an anti-corruption office. And again, we know from research that talking in these terms does not move people to agree with you. That technical language does not touch people's values and get through to their emotions. So instead, you have to talk about what these policies deliver in people's lives. There's been some research in the US where campaigners asked voters, do you agree with the minimum wage? And support for this was a lot lower than when they were asked, do you agree that people who work should earn enough to support their families? The same research showed that people weren't as supportive when they were asked if they agreed with the policy of paid parental leave, compared with when they were asked, do you want to be there the first time your newborn smiles? So similarly, if you want to create an anti-corruption office, for example, you need to talk about what that delivers. So you might say something like, we will make sure that the resources that we contribute for each other fund the things that our communities need instead of lining the pockets of billionaires. And that's why we will create an anti-corruption office. Of course, a lot of messaging in the final weeks of the campaign related to the war in Ukraine. And there, the United Opposition's message was, let's belong to the West, to EU, to NATO, and not to the East and to Putin. But again, this messaging doesn't really give people a vision to vote for. The East or West argument seemed to boil down to two things. One thing was, don't support Orban because he's like Putin. He's copied Putin's domestic policies of corruption, cronyism, attacks on the media, illiberalism, and attacks against NGOs. But a lot of voters don't see how these things connect to the problems that they care about, like not being able to turn on the heating or fill their cars at the petrol pump. If you want people to care, you have to link those problems to the things that people care about. And I'll come on to how you do that in a moment. The second element of the East versus West argument was that actually, it's Orban, the person who's dragging the country into war because of his closeness to Putin, and we, the United Opposition, want to bring peace by siding with the West. But basically what's happening here is the United Opposition is contradicting Fidesz's claim that they want to drag Hungary into war. And from a messaging perspective, that's a problem. Remember, Fidesz manufactures the threat of war because it needs to make the public scared, because a fearful public moves to the right. So what's the result of that? The public just keeps hearing again and again about the threat of war, and because of Orban's media domination, they still think that the united opposition is the source of that threat. So in the end, the united opposition's messaging just ends up reinforcing the mood that Fidesz wants to create, which is one of existential threat. So, okay, you might be wondering that, have I backed us into a corner? Does that mean that we can't talk about the problems that Fidesz has created? Does that mean that we can't point out Fidesz's misinformation? No, it doesn't. We do need to talk about the problems. We do need to dissolve misinformation, but you just need to do it differently. You can do it differently. So when you talk about the problem, it has to be balanced against your positive vision of what people can vote for, and it also has to be balanced against the positive idea that there is a solution that people can unite behind. So the balance of your message becomes different. It's not all about the problem. It's kind of a quarter about the problem and 3/4 about vision and solution. The second principle of persuasive progressive messaging I'll mention is that you need to expose your opponent's malign intentions and strategy. So all these problems that Fidesz has caused or invented, they all fit together as part of a strategy. Why is Orban trying to create division and hatred? Why is he letting schools and hospitals crumble? Why has he taken over the media? Why does he attack NGOs? Why is he trying to scare people about the war? And how do all of these lies fit together in a way that harms ordinary Hungarians? I think if the united opposition's message had addressed these questions, they would have achieved, or they could have achieved, two things. First, they would have helped voters let go of misinformation. So we know that the way to dissolve lies isn't to contradict them. Research shows that if you contradict lies, it actually embeds misinformation in the mind of your audience. So instead, you actually need to give people a reason to question the trustworthiness of the source of the misinformation. And you do that by revealing that they have a malign hidden agenda. And the second thing the opposition could have achieved by answering these questions would be to show ordinary Hungarians how attacks against NGOs, marginalized groups, the EU, the media, which they don't think are relevant to them, absolutely do harm them because they're part of a strategy designed to divide and distract citizens from the corruption and incompetence that is creating the problems they care about. So what could that kind of message look like? I had a shot at it. I'm not saying it's perfect, but something like this. Whether we live in the city or the countryside, most of us want our elected representatives to deliver the things our communities rely on, like good schools that equip our children to build our country's future and modern hospitals so our loved ones can get the care they need. But our current leaders have instead stolen our resources, handing out juicy contracts to business friends in return for bribes and special favors. And now our services are crumbling. So they try to scare Hungarians with lies about the opposition to make voters afraid to demand new leaders who will work for all of us. But we're onto them. We know that when we come together, we can elect politicians who will support our communities by using our resources to fund the schools, hospitals, and roads that we rely on to prosper. Now, that example message explains how Fidesz invented the threat of war to divide and scare voters, but you can use the same structure of message to explain how Fidesz used hatred against marginalized groups to divide and distract voters from their failings. And campaigners in the USA have been successful in various Senate races using this message to expose strategic racism by the far right. It's something that they've called the race-class narrative. I think the united opposition maybe wasted an opportunity to call out strategic division against LGBTIQ people or people who migrate, perhaps because their advisors told them that defending these groups would lose them support. And that's a common mistake on parties on the left. If you don't talk about racism, homophobia, misogynism, you end up potentially alienating your own base. If you do talk about how a strategy is used to harm us, then you still mobilize your base, but you can also move persuadable voters because you help them see how that division is a tool to stop them getting what they need. So I'll wrap up just to say that I think the election results can teach us three things when it comes to messaging. One is to talk about what we're fighting for rather than what we're fighting against. Two is, when we're talking about human rights don't use law and policy language that doesn't connect to people's values and emotions. Instead, we need to explain how people can use their rights as tools to create the lives that they want for themselves and their loved ones. And 3 is to explain how the division, hatred and fear that's being peddled by the government are all part of a strategy that harms ordinary Hungarians.
Wow, thank you.